But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend, by every means at our command.
Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where we discuss leaders, their decisions, and how they shape the world we live in today. Welcome to another thrilling episode of the History in Motion podcast, where the past comes alive and decisions echo through the ages. I'm your host, Ritchie, and today we're diving into the corridors of power, secrecy, and intrigue. In this episode, we'll explore the enigmatic figure of J. Edgar Hoover, the man who shaped and molded the FBI into a formidable institution. Under his watchful eye, the agency grew from a minor bureaucracy into an intelligence powerhouse. But power, as we'll see, is a double-edged sword. From wiretaps to secret files, Hoover's tenure was marked by an unrelenting quest for control. His relentless crusade against the perceived threats led him down paths of overreach and abuse, most notably his efforts to subvert civil rights movements and leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. Join us as we unravel the complexity of Hoover's leadership, the decisions that defined his legacy, and the impact that still resonates today. We'll uncover the man behind the legend, exploring the ambition that drove him, the choices that guided him, and the strategies that made him both a hero and a villain. As we delve into this multifaceted story, we'll examine how one man's actions can not only shape an era, but set history in motion.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the History in Motion podcast, where today we are talking about a man who ran the FBI for 40 years.
You could say ruled.
Yeah, I think ruled might actually have been a better word. So we'll say, ruled / ran the FBI for over 40 years and actually reported up into 8 different presidents. And that's J. Edgar Hoover, who, if you go to Washington today, the main FBI building is named after him. He is the founder, creator, Lord Master of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And I think just Rich going through the research was, to live as long as he did. And I was just telling you offline, like he was in power so long that it's the equivalent of if somebody was in office when Lincoln was in charge and then left office when Woodrow Wilson was in charge during World War I, to just kind of give you a mental idea of how many years he was in charge and how many major American moments he was really involved with. And I think we'll see he's got his hands in pretty much everything for a long, long time.
Yeah, I think his reach, and as you were actually speaking, and we had kind of talked about this offline before we hopped on to record, was, they put a limitation in place after him where a director of the FBI could only serve for 10 years. And 10 years might be pretty long too, to be honest with you. Now, the more that I think about it, but I think it definitely kind of gets at the heart of a particular issue in my mind, which is when someone gets that deeply embedded within this, intelligence infrastructure, pseudo-intelligence, pseudo-law enforcement, and obviously we'll get into the, overreaches of him and the FBI during his tenure. But it is, it's quite telling what can happen to an institution when the said leader of that institution, it's hard to parse out the difference between an objective goal of, the FBI versus what his motivations and intentions were. And I think, even when I was doing his biography, I kind of noticed this as I was doing it, was I'm almost referring synonymously to the FBI and Hoover as one and the same person.
I like that. Yeah, because you can't separate them. You really can't.
It's really hard to. It's really hard to.
Yeah, and I think it's funny, like it's just such you were talking about like the term limit now that they have on it. I think it's something that always, you go back to the founders, right? They were so worried about just, a king-like presence coming into the presidency and Washington kind of setting the precedent for, 2 terms and then eventually it becoming part of the Constitution. I don't think they really had in mind that there was going to be this police force, if you will, that kind of that ran everything. But yeah, I think you're right. It is a very American thing where they're terrified of someone getting that embedded, and we can see with Hoover that he definitely got embedded and he wasn't going anywhere, and it took literally death to kind of take him out of that job. Like presidents were even scared to kind of face him and come across him.
And that, I think that's very telling. And again, I think it just speaks to the foresight of the founding fathers.
Yeah, you keep looking back and you're like, yeah, they've seen this before. They studied their history. They know how this all goes. But I think the most interesting question I had was, how does a guy like Hoover get into power and then hold so much power for so long? And so I think where I found as I was doing the research was I was looking up all the civil unrest that was happening in the US at the time, just kind of before he comes onto the scene. And it just all kept happening right after World War II. So 1919 was the big year where a lot of things were happening. And the summer of 1919 is actually called the Red Summer for all the different violence and unrest that was happening throughout the U.S. So World War One ends in 1918. You have 4.7 million U.S. military personnel deployed during the war, and many are returning home. And this is really the first time you have the mass, I could almost call it a migration of troops, of Americans leaving the country and then coming back. Other wars may have, were in and around the U.S. and people were still stationed in the U.S., but this is, going across to Europe for years at times in some cases. And so you're bringing all of these people back and you don't really have a great plan on how to reintegrate them into society, try to find them jobs, all those kind of things. So now you have a bunch of military personnel who don't really know what to do with themselves. They may have lost previous jobs that they had. They don't really know what to do. So there's a little bit of unrest that kind of comes into play. And then on top of that, the Spanish flu is just ripping its way through the entire planet at this point, but the US in particular. So the Spanish flu kills anywhere between 25 to 50 million people. And the craziest thing, and I think I've said this on a previous podcast, but it killed more people than all of World War I did, the Spanish flu. So just to put into context how, you go through a war and now you come back and illness is kind of burning its way through your entire country. And the rough estimate is about 675,000 Americans died within a matter of a few years from the Spanish flu.
Wow.
So lots of death, lots of unrest, not sure what to do with people. It's just it's a tricky time.
That's a pretty staunch figure, right? And it's interesting that, when we grow up, we talk about World War One. We kind of just glaze over the Spanish flu. If
We really do,
if it's even mentioned at all. I wonder why that is. But I just think back to, when we were learning about it in like grade school and even in like upper year classes. It's like, yeah, the Spanish flu happened after the war. And we just kind of move on into, the next chapter. But yeah, it seems like a tumultuous time across the board. And as I was doing his biography, it seems like, there's all these eras that he kind of grew and evolved in lockstep with the FBI, but they were always, a tumultuous era. It's like the gangster era, which is like during the Depression, you have the Red Scare, the civil rights movement. And maybe this is just, this kind of nostalgic lens, or hindsight's always 2020, and we have the the advantage of kind of looking backwards and creating these eras, because obviously they didn't name these eras while they were in them, but we have the advantage of doing that. But it seems like there was a lack of settlement across the board in terms of how society's functioning. There's a lot of upheaval, there's a lot of tension across cultures, across societies. There's no real equilibrium. Right. And I think that was kind of one of my takeaways when I was doing his biography in a very chronological order.
Yeah. And I think you'll see too, like this is the progressive movements are really starting throughout the world. And this is something that Hoover's going to come up against from literally the moment he steps into office up to the day he dies, with a bunch of different things that go on, kind of culminating with the civil rights movement of the 60s and his adversarial relationship with Martin Luther King and the black leaders kind of in that civil rights movement. So, kind of going back to 1919, though, it's these type of movements are still already starting to happen. Not so much from a racial side yet. We'll get into that. But the first side is the women's suffrage movement. So the women are looking for the right to vote. And the 19th Amendment will be passed in 1920, which gives women the right to vote. So there's a lot of protesting, a lot of pushes for this very, very progressive movement. This is kind of like you hear a lot of times throughout history. It's like, oh, if we give women the right to vote, then Black people are next, or what's next after this and what next after that. So that's the world Hoover is really growing up in, is this, you give an inch, they're going to take a yard in his mind from a progressive standpoint. And then progressive politics leads to anarchy, which leads to a bunch of other things. And so they're always kind of fighting that.
Suffragettes, because in my research, I found that he actually was vehemently against women getting the vote.
It's on brand, I guess, for him, right?
And he actually fired all the women in the FBI.
Oh, come on. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, on brand, I guess.
There you go.
Yeah, he's the staunch conservative. And I think we see this in history, right? You have people kind of on the left side of the political spectrum go too far to the left, you kind of lose order and there's a bit more chaos that kind of happens. But then if you move too right on the conservative side of the spectrum, that's when you get government overreach and really kind of buttoned up, and this is the way things work, and rights of individuals are really clamped down, and
Yep.
all those sort of things. And he's definitely trying to pull things back into the conservative direction, and people are trying to pull it more into that left side. And it's that tug of war, I think, that we see throughout US history. But I think at this point, yeah, you can definitely tell what side of the spectrum he's on and where he wants things to stay. So one of the other things that happened was race riots are happening throughout the United States at an unprecedented level. So we see over the last, so from about 1909 to 1919, there's something kind of called the Great Migration, where a lot of African Americans were moving from the South up to the North. So it's far enough after slavery has ended that enough African Americans can start to get on their feet a little bit in terms of having money to leave parts of the South. And many of them settle in Chicago. So for example, in a 10-year period, the black population of Chicago grew from 44,000 people to over 100,000. So cities aren't as big as they are today. So that's a pretty sizable number. Mm-hmm. And again, we saw with all these troops coming back, and if you don't have proper ways to make sure there's significant housing for people and all of these sort of things and jobs as well, tensions can start to flare, especially in a segregated world where black and white are, you draw a line down the middle of the city, and that's the black neighborhood and the white neighborhood. And when those people start to cross those lines, you start to run into problems. So one of the riots that happened started with a teenager named Eugene Williams, who he went for a swim. And while he was swimming, there was apparently a cable car, like a rail car floating in the lake. And so he grabbed onto it and was just kind of hanging out. But then the cable or the rail car started to float towards another beach. The problem was it was a quote unquote whites only beach. And so being an African American, he's not welcome at this white only beach. And so the white occupants saw him kind of coming towards the beach, and so they decided to start throwing stones at him, I guess, as one does. And unfortunately, he gets hit with a rock, probably knocks him out or makes him lose his grip, and within a few minutes, he's under the water and has drowned. So again, something very non-threatening, innocent, and now you have a child's death, right? Yeah. So as a result, an angry crowd of African Americans soon arrive at the scene. Anger's escalating when police refuse to arrest any of the white people who were throwing the rocks. And so a fight erupts, and then someone fires into the police, and then just kind of starts going back and forth. And then as I was reading this, I just kept thinking about the partition episode that we talked about, how you have just kind of this electricity in the air, and one person steps a little bit too far, and then that causes someone else, and then it kind of cascades, and then you have this full-on riot happening. So there's a full-on riot going on in Chicago where gangs of white men were running after trying to find any black person they could find and do harm to them, and then vice versa. You had gangs of African Americans running after white gangs trying to beat them up, and it was just like a disaster. And so a report came out the year after. Basically, the report stated, as darkness came on, white gangsters became active. Negroes in white districts suffered severely at their hands. From 9 p.m. to 3 a.m., 27 Negroes were beaten, 7 were stabbed, and 4 were shot. So this is more than 4 hours, like a 7-hour period overnight, just indiscriminate violence looking to really hurt people. And this is where you can start to see, okay, there's a lot of unrest that's happening. Nobody wants this happening, black or white. People want someone to kind of clamp down on this. And so there's a book called Chicago's Tragic Summer of 1919. And one of the quotes from it that kind of sums it up nicely was, there was an orgy of violence that was revolting in many ways, and the police seemed incapable of doing anything about it. So again, this need for law and order is there, but the police physically can't do anything about it because there's so much violence and so much madness. So over that summer, 38 people had died, with over 500 being injured due to various riots and unrest that was happening. So there's a need, right? Someone's got to step in, and we'll get into who that's going to be in a minute. But there's just some other things going on around the world too that I think are important, and that comes from our old friends, the Soviet Union. They're just becoming a country, and the communist revolution is underway and kind of wrapping up within Russia, where a far left group of revolutionary Marxists founded by Vladimir Lenin, known as the Bolsheviks. They use the increase of people in cities and growing income inequality as a springboard to kind of galvanize the nation into a revolution, and then couple that with the weak leadership of Tsar Nicholas II. And then ultimately this revolution was called like the workers' revolution. We're fighting for the people against oppression. And so this sends a shockwave through pretty much all of the Western world, because you see this establishment of whether it's royalty, parliamentary systems of a certain group of people who have control of basically everything. And now you see that this grassroots populist movement is rising up and trying to make a play at the seat of government, and they ultimately win. And so now this whole fear kind of strikes around the world, and especially in the West. And now we get the Red Scare coming to the United States. So there was always fears that this was going to happen in the United States, because we also have to think too, there's no real labor laws yet. This is when we start to see the workers' rights movements coming up. There was workers basically saying, like, if you leave your job due to injury or something, they could fire you. Little things like that we take for granted today of, well, you got hurt on the job, well, we'll just get the next man up, and whoever can do that. So with the workers starting to demand more rights, minorities and women's demanding more rights, and this overall push for more progressive policies, many feared that if these progressive movements were not put down, it would lead right into a communist revolution. So like we said before, if we keep giving an inch, they're going to take a yard. If we give them another inch, they're going to take a yard. And so the worry is always, it's just always going to roll into communism. This starts at this time. It really doesn't end until basically the Soviet Union falls. There's always this communist scares as well. So even this went up to Woodrow Wilson. So him and the authorities around him viewed the alarm of African American advocacy for racial equality, labor rights, and the right of victims of mobs to defend themselves. So in a private conversation, Woodrow Wilson said African Americans returning from abroad would be our greatest medium into conveying Bolshevism into Americans. So Bolshevism being Lenin's group of communism, essentially. So there's this fear that, first off, I always just find this crazy to me. You've just sent a group of people to fight on behalf of your country. And when they come back, you're like, yeah, they're probably bringing communism back. So we should, not treat them correctly. Racism obviously is a thing, but when you put that uniform on,
it's a great irony, right?
Yeah.
The more you think about it, and as you're speaking, I can't help but think, instead of being afraid of communism, you could have potentially used it as an opportunity to address the plights of, your populace and the different communities and groups that feel unheard, underserved. Instead, you just label them communists.
Simple, right? We talk again, I go back to our partition episode where we just say you're in a group and that's your group. And that's how I'm going to think of everybody around you. And even like Oppenheimer as well, when we talked about it, it's like this person, was in the Communist Party and you talk to somebody, therefore you're in this group. And it's just, I think it ends up becoming a method of control. And I can understand a little bit from where the authorities are coming from. If they want to keep order. That's the most important thing, because so much is changing. And if you just allow everybody to do whatever they want, things get out of control. But we're talking about basic stuff. And I don't think it's lost on anybody that everybody should have the right to vote. It's in the Constitution. So yeah, it is a bit silly, all things considered. But I just want to talk about one of the strikes that happened, because I think it's just funny kind of what happens with, guess what? They're striking, therefore communism. So so there's strikes happening all over the country. And a famous one is called the Seattle General Strike. So a city of 315,000 people at the time stopped working. 25,000 other union members had joined. 35,000 shipyard workers who are already on strike. So it was mostly peaceful, but newspapers and stuff were saying, this is something that only happens in Russia. How dare people strike and stop working? Like, you should be, it's just like this workers' rights was just seen as communism automatically. So the strike kind of collapses because there's just too many people involved, and it's misguided and not unified, and people just eventually just kind of go back to work. But the mayor took credit for ending the strike that only was about 5 days, and the press was like, this is great, pushing back against communism. But he resigned a few months later and started giving lectures, the dangers of communism or the dangers of Bolshevism around the country. So it's like, strike for 5 days equals I fought off communism. Again, it's all very silly, but this is how everybody's thinking. They're thinking that rights is communism and communism is bad. And it just, we're going to keep saying it. And I know we talked last time about like how religion is everything. In this case, like, I don't think it goes quite as far as we would say Catholic Spain went, but it goes pretty far into say communism is everything that people are scared about. And it's a perfect galvanization piece for people who kind of want to seize power.
The conflation of communism with like all the things that you're talking about, right? Just because you're anti-fascist and you don't want your government to overstep doesn't necessarily make you a communist. But in this era, it could very well label you a communist. right? So any type of pushback, critical thinking, critical opinion being expressed, if you don't toe the line perfectly, you are essentially, risking being labeled a communist and ending up on someone's list.
Yeah, if you end up on these lists, like you hear stories of people who found out that they were, they're part of the Communist Party, left, and they were blacklisted from working in their community. They would move to other cities, and then somebody, to probably the FBI, would write a letter to their new employer saying you just hired a communist, and then you were fired.
Wild.
Which is insane to me. So a couple more things to kind of bring up at this time, and then we'll kind of jump into Hoover's bio and a little bit of the stuff he got up to. So I think I say here, race relations are at an all-time low. So obviously not all-time in terms of the U.S., but I think since slavery, definitely there was probably some improvement, but I think it's starting to go in the other direction. So the trend is not getting better and better. We're seeing all of these race riots, and in the 30 years prior to Woodrow Wilson getting into office, 3,000 black men and women are lynched. And basically, Woodrow Wilson admits that the states seem unable or unwilling to stop the lynchings. So either they're like they don't care, or there's no authority figure, someone who's coming in and stopping these lynchings. Again,
3,000.
Yeah,
That's a horrifying number.
Yeah. And it's such a public display too. It's a spectacle. That's what I think makes it.
It's like a public execution, right?
It really is. Yeah.
It is a public. There is, this very sadistic, theatrical kind of element there. It's public. It's theater. People galvanize for it because you have this kind of unification of a community of people who are now seeing, this symbol, this exercise of lynching someone that solidifies their public opinion of a particular group. Like it's devastating on a lot of levels.
Yeah, and you can see why, there's the small minority who's willing to get in to actually go do the lynchings and be present at it. And there's a lot of people who are seeing what's going on and going, oh my God, like this can't happen. This level of violence in public we just can't have it. So again, I'm going to keep saying it, there's more of a push for some leader to kind of come in. And the last thing that kind of happens is, and I didn't realize this, there was a lot of just bombs that were mailed to people's houses and government buildings and stuff. So a notable one, again, in 1919, an anarchist named Carlo Valdinucci blew up in front of the newly appointed Attorney General's home in Washington. So the Attorney General was named Mitchell Palmer. So he blew himself up in the process when the bomb exploded too early. So the bombing was just one in a series of raids that were coordinated against judges, politicians, law enforcement officers around 8 cities. They had about a month earlier, radicals had also mailed bombs to the mayor of Seattle, a U.S. senator, blowing the hands off the senator's domestic worker. The next day, a postal worker in New York City intercepted 16 more packages addressed to political and business leaders, including J.D. Rockefeller. So there's now people are worried to open up their mail. And this is just pure anarchy, right? This is terrorism. From a domestic scale, right? Just blowing things up for the sake of trying to overthrow the government or kind of push forward some political agenda. So as a result, the U.S. Justice Department under President Woodrow Wilson's administration decided that we need to start rounding up some of these people. So that leads to the capture and arrest of suspected socialists or communists, especially anarchists and communists, and deport them from the United States. So we have to remember at this time, too, a lot of Italian, German, Catholic immigrants, specifically Irish, most likely, are kind of a bigger group of those Catholics, are moving to the U.S. and facing a crazy amount of racism, especially Germans. You just fought a war, Italians as well. And so there's just this piece of enemy aliens. These people are from other places. Let's just get rid of them. So like we said, these raids particularly target a lot of Italian immigrants, Eastern European immigrants, Jewish immigrants, and anybody who really had leftist ties. And of course, labor unions as well were targeted. And so these were done under the leadership of Attorney General Mitchell Palmer, who was the person who had the bomb blown up in front of his house, and arrested over 10,000 people. So again, these are political prisoners for the most part. Definitely there's some people who are putting bombs in mailboxes and stuff, and that's clearly against the law, but there's a lot of people who are just suspected and end up getting arrested on essentially trumped up charges. So I think this is probably a good point to bring in Hoover, because as we've said, we've laid the land here, I think, pretty well of there is anarchy essentially sweeping across the nation, I'm sure, as he would have seen it. But there is a lot of unrest, and there is a need for a more national police force and somebody to kind of bring things together. And as you can start to see how people are feeling at this time, maybe someone who will go and do some of the dirty work and maybe will step over the line where it's needed. And so it starts really with some of these raids where Hoover comes onto the scene. But yeah, I think we should introduce Hoover here, and with the kind of the scene that's been set on someone like him is really needed, or really just seen to be needed at the time.
Yeah, so we'll take it back to the very beginning, and then I think a good crossover point will be the Palmer raids. But yeah, so J. Edgar Hoover was born in Washington D.C. on January 1st, 1895, which surprised me a bit because I didn't think he was born. I guess his longevity, really surprised me as I was doing my research. But yeah, in 1895, he was born in a white Protestant middle class neighborhood known as Seward Square, 3 blocks behind the Capitol. So his family had been civil servants for generations. His father, Dickerson Naylor Hoover, had worked for the Coast Guard. Hoover was closest to his mother, however, Annie. She was kind of the disciplinarian and moral guide of the family. He actually ended up living with her until she died in 1938 in the same house that he grew up in. She passed away when he was 43, and he lived with her up until that point. He kind of had a falling out with his father. His father, lost his job as a civil servant, and based on what I read, it seems like he was suffering from pretty severe mental health issues at the time. And that kind of, really played a big part in the separation between him and his son. So in 1916, he graduates from George Washington University with a degree in law. 1917, he receives a master's degree in law from George Washington University and begins working at the Department of Justice. And then in 1918, he becomes the Assistant Attorney General a year later. That would lead the GID, which is the General Intelligence Division, which would actually transition to the Bureau of Investigation not too long following the Red Scare of 1919. And then if we kind of loop back to the Palmer raid. So while he was working as a clerk at the Library of Congress, which is super interesting because one of the things that we'll talk about is how he was able to modernize the FBI. And one of the things that the FBI was able to do quite successfully under his leadership was come up with a record and filing system that was able to kind of coordinate and collate and then cross-reference material quite quickly. It really helped propel them into this kind of new age of innovation and kind of technical know-how on how to actually document and profile criminals. And a lot of this came from his work as a librarian at the Library of Congress as a clerk.
It's pretty cool. You wouldn't expect your librarian to be, leading the FBI for 40 years. It's definitely a transition you don't expect. But yeah, it's interesting, right? Like, I think it teaches everybody, those skills you learn at one job that may not seem totally relevant, that you always lean back on every little piece of experience you have, no matter where you work.
As a trained librarian, not that I'm biased or anything, but it definitely there's something symbolic there that kind of stuck with me, which is he definitely understood the importance of information gathering, right? You can see it in his legacy. He was able to mass just volumes and volumes and volumes of information on people. Like that was his asset to be able to control and position the way he did so successfully. But we'll get to that. So his efficiency and obviously his conservatism drew the attention of the Attorney General, Mitchell Palmer, in the midst of the hysteria that we were just discussing, this so-called communist infiltration of America after the war. And like you said, Paul, anarchists had bombed Palmer's home in 1919. So essentially, the Attorney General used this attack to initiate that widespread clampdown on radicalism. And Hoover, who was seen as this kind of straight-laced, highly moral person, was a natural choice to kind of head this campaign. So he took the lead on the Palmer raids, this widespread attack on these radicals. And it's interesting because I know you just touched on it, but it seems like there wasn't many formal search or arrest warrants that were created to do these raids. The enforcers didn't really pay attention to who was guilty or who wasn't, in terms of who was actually there at these insurrectionary activities. Massive amounts of people were arrested when they were held. The environment and conditions in which they were held were definitely not to standard from what I read. People weren't fed, people weren't given water, they were cramped into jail cells, people got deported. And I think it gives you an early sense of what they're willing to do to clamp down on radicalism.
Yeah, and I think part of it is public perception. Like you can't be doing nothing, you need to be doing something. And in this case, we arrested 10,000 people that we feel are suspected of whatever you want to make up. And so, I think there's that, they're definitely willing to go over the line and kind of throw, basic rights that an American citizen would have, throw those out, but try to balance hey, we need to show mass arrests on a large scale to show that we're actually doing something.
Yeah, no, exactly. And it's interesting, right? So years later, the methods by which the Palmer raids were executed eventually came into question. So Palmer actually had to resign after the fact.
Wow.
But somehow Hoover's reputation remained clean, which is, quite interesting. So he emerged actually on the better side of things with kind of this distinction of a guy who was loyal to his country. And in 1924, President Calvin Coolidge appoints him the head of the Bureau of Investigation, a position that Hoover had long coveted. So now he's finally in this position that he has received the power that he has so craved, up until this point. So he inherits the Bureau, which had been, pretty severely tainted with scandals from previous administrations. Upon its acceptance, Hoover demanded it be completely divorced from politics and responsible only to the Attorney General. And his conditions were met, and he set out on a rejuvenation campaign, which would build the Bureau into one of the most powerful government agencies in 20th century America. I think it's probably important to note too, like, what did the FBI look like? Obviously, this isn't a podcast about the FBI, but just as a whole, it's probably good to keep in mind that it was largely seen as extremely inefficient. They lacked professionalism. They were extremely corrupt and didn't really have a lot of political influence, limited resources and jurisdiction, and they just didn't really have a sense of focus or direction. So, largely speaking, it wasn't really well organized or very effective for what they were set out to do from the early days.
Yeah, it seems like it needed that almost that modernization stamp on it, and I think part of his MO coming out of being a librarian is organization is key, and it's even just like maybe some of the clerical stuff and just kind of getting everybody involved. But I go back to the point you made about him wanting it to not be political. And it's just funny because you kind of can see
ironic,
where
right?
I think we'll get into more of that, but it's just kind of funny that we'll see where everything goes. But yeah, it's probably good that it's not officially political, but when you're arresting high profile people, there's always going to be some politics to it.
Or corrupt,
right?
Ironically.
Yes.
Right? Corrupt and political. Yeah, I thought that was funny. So if we kind of push back or push up to the 30s and 40s, and we kind of look at, I know you've done a great job at looking at the backdrop of what's going on around the world, specifically what's going on within the States. So under Hoover's leadership, the FBI grows in size and scope. They take on cases involving bank robbery, kidnapping, extortion, and they play a key role in enforcing prohibition laws. I've never heard of this particular era, but it's quite interesting. So a lot of historians have dubbed this kind of the gangster era, kind of depression era with bank robbers, people kind of just running amok across and really just stratifying this cohesion that exists on a social level. So he's functioning against this backdrop of rampant crime rings perpetrated by bootlegging gangsters. And this is interesting, and we'll get into it, but this whole Hollywood and pop culture romanticizing these figures into lawless heroes. To make his agency respectable, he thought he had to assemble an elite group of men, white, college educated, who would represent the Bureau as agents. And he demanded conformity with a very strict moral code from all of them. He wanted them to abstain from alcohol, relations with women. He instituted training school and effectively made his organization into this symbolic guardian of the country's law, citizens, and its morals. And if we're looking at some of these crime rings and, Hollywood and pop culture kind of romanticizing these figures, which we still kind of do today. Some of the criminal actors or groups that he targeted and effectively took down, John Dillinger, Bonnie and Clyde, Babyface Nelson, Al Capone, organized crime families, so the mafia as a whole. You have obviously communist and subversive groups. Then we have civil rights leaders, or the Weather Underground, which was a offshoot of this Democratic Students Union, which was much more radical and much more anarchist. So again, under his direction, the Bureau continued to grow in responsibility and importance overall. They became an integral part of the national government and an icon in American pop culture. So in the 30s, the FBI, they attacked violent crime by gangsters and implemented programs to professionalize U.S. law enforcement through training and forensic assistance. For example, they opened up its own technical laboratory to provide forensic analysis on investigations, as well as services to other federal, states, and local law enforcement officials. He also established the index list, which essentially categorized and ranked people by political affiliation and the likelihood of their criminal activity or association with criminal elements, read communism, more or less. But again, you're kind of seeing this very organized, very bookish kind of approach to documenting, classifying people. It's very interesting how this man's mind works. And I think you can start seeing how the institution starts to take shape in a way that, he's kind of curating and crafting.
Yeah, I think it's almost like when you're talking about the almost ranking system, and these people might commit crimes, so we need to keep an eye on them, which is, I think, the whole point of, you have to have a warrant, you have to go through the proper process. You can't go out of your way to do anything to someone who hasn't committed a crime yet. But I can see, yeah,
right?
really. Yeah. It's like, what's that movie? Is it with Tom Cruise where they like have the
Minority
system?
Report.
Yeah, Minority Report, right? That's
Yeah.
almost what he's trying to do, right?
Yeah.
Is, oh, if we can predict crime, but then who gets to pull the levers on what we decide? And, you know, when you can put someone in different boxes and different groups, it's like communist, civil rights leader, labor leader. Well, they're probably top of the list because those are all
100%.
things that are against American values in their eyes.
No, it's quite interesting how this kind of all evolves and unfolds. So, you know, and he kept evolving the institution overall to kind of correct criticisms that were made of predecessors who were running the FBI. You know, he fired a number of agents who he considered to be political appointees or unqualified to be special agents. He would order background checks, you know, very intensive interviews, physical testing for new agents. And he even, you know, required at one point for new agents to have either legal or accounting training to be eligible to be a part of the FBI. So this was his whole kind of, you know, his whole imperative to professionalize the bureau. So these very rigorous hiring practice and standards, having a background in law or accounting to undergo intensive training. So this obviously led to an increase in the overall like professionalism and competence of the bureau's agents. And obviously from a PR perspective, it looks really good too. But he also introduced like very modern technologies to the bureau. He established a centralized fingerprint file, a forensic laboratory, a comprehensive crime reporting system. So again, he's enhancing the ability through human capital and technical capabilities to investigate and solve crimes. They also expanded its jurisdiction responsibilities under Hoover. So it took on cases involving bank robbery, kidnapping, extortion. And, you know, they played a pivotal part in enforcing prohibition. And then obviously during World War II, there's whole like counter-espionage and counterintelligence operations that we'll get into. And this was super interesting, which I didn't know too much about. And Paul, let me know if you read more into this, was how he was able to use the media to enhance the FBI's reputation. You know, he worked very closely with Hollywood to produce films and television shows that portrayed the FBI as a force of good, fighting against crime and corruption. And I guess like this whole idea of, you know, the G-man, which I thought was really interesting, something that I never really considered from a pop culture perspective.
Yeah, I think what I saw too was Hollywood, and I think you kind of mentioned it with like Bonnie and Clyde and John Dillinger and all them. It was like you had this kind of romanticizing of these lawless criminals who are kind of just going from town to town doing what they need to do, and that's kind of what Hollywood loved. And then you just kind of see it flip, where it's like now you are the sheriff rolls into town and he cleans things up, and now the FBI shows up, and there's all these television shows and different things. And just something you were mentioning, now you talk about radio and television and all the modernization efforts that he put in. I just find it interesting for someone who's really kind of more conservative from a political standpoint and doesn't want to see things change politically, but from a technological standpoint and from how things need to work, he's very, very progressive, very, very kind of new age, and has fantastic foresight into what are the things that we're going to need long term. And again, a database of fingerprints and having a way to catalog all the information that's coming through from a crime perspective and all the case files, and how can we look back at old cases and stuff like that in an effective way.
National perspective too, right? Like helping interagency, interstate police and law enforcement organizations to support their efforts as well. Very much this kind of, you know, this nationalistic sense of, you know, we're here to help and support this very grand battle against the evils that may be out here.
Yeah, definitely. It's, I think, something that you could tell that the country really needed when we go back to Woodrow Wilson saying the states are not able to stop this, where it turns into, I'm sure if the lynching problem happened when the FBI was around, it would be, this is a national problem that the FBI is going to go take care of because now they have the capability to do so. So yeah, It really is a huge change for really the way policing and law enforcement is done across the entire country.
Yeah, and it's super interesting. I guess if we keep moving forward with like the, you know, chronologically speaking, so if we kind of, I know we've talked about it already, but the years following World War II, you know, I think it would be probably an understatement to say that Hoover became obsessed with the threat, real or not, widespread communist subversion. You know, there was a lot of high profile cases, but he, you know, positioned himself as America's foremost defender against the spread of communism. He found a receptive audience in the hearings of, you know, the House of the very active committees within Senate and the government. During the McCarthy era, you know, the FBI at Hoover's direction investigated essentially anyone suspected of communist sympathies. They did not require a search warrant. If there was even the faintest scent of communist sympathies, you could be under investigation vis-a-vis the FBI reaching out to local enforcement agency for them to go knock on your door because you may be writing a op-ed on some sort of critical piece on how your local government is overstretching their regulations on something, and that could lead to knock on your door saying, hey, are you a communist? Point blank, is your husband a communist? And yeah, like that's the kind of things we're talking about right now, and that's how far he would go to essentially ensure that America wasn't being subverted.
It's interesting you mentioned McCarthyism and Senator McCarthy, because something I read that was interesting was he actually pushed back against Senator McCarthy and said basically like, you're going too far with just accusing people. And I wonder if it's kind of going into his head a little bit, because I almost kind of start to see with Hoover, it's like, if it's not me kind of setting the rules, it should be nobody. And we even see this when the Japanese are put into internment camps, Japanese Americans, during World War II. Hoover's actually very against this and very outspoken, saying this is not the way, this isn't going to do anything, this is just a disaster of an idea. But some argue that he's basically saying that because by locking up all of these Japanese Americans, it's basically a direct shot at the FBI, saying, well, the FBI can't find the actual Japanese Americans that are the threat versus the ones who are just law-abiding citizens. Yep. And so you kind of get this like weird mix of, yeah, he seems like he's pushing back against things that are terrible, but what's the true motive there? And I don't think we can say one way or another, but I just find it interesting that you can start to see this power kind of come into his head of, if it's not my team or I'm the one dictating things, I'm going to push back against it, whether it's right or wrong. So I know it's kind of interesting.
He knew how to play the optics game. Like
he did.
He played the optics game very, very well, just by way of talking about how he was able to, work with Hollywood producers, journalists, news anchors, like this kind of PR machine that he had kind of curated to support how the general public kind of viewed the FBI and G-men as a whole. I think he played the optics game very well. It's interesting that you say that, because everything that I've read more or less would say that he was totally in the same camp as McCarthy was, but maybe we can follow up after the fact to kind of validate that. But even with with Roosevelt, so in the 40s and 50s, President Roosevelt tasked the Bureau with running foreign intelligence services in the Western Hemisphere. So this operation was called Special Intelligence Services, or SIS. And I believe this might be the forerunner of the CIA, but I'm not sure.
I think you're right. Yeah, it sounds familiar.
Yeah. So in the early years of the Cold War, the Bureau actually took on the added responsibility of investigating the backgrounds of government employees to ensure that foreign agents did not infiltrate the government. But they, it's funny, they were like so widespread in terms of what their scope was. So they're doing background checks on government employees, but they're also involved in more traditional criminal investigations like car thefts, bank robberies, and kidnappings, which also remained very important to them as well. I think if we shift up a little bit more to kind of the crux of, the conversation that we've been focused on, which is this whole, civil rights movement and how Hoover kind of played a part in it. I think this might be the darkest stain on Hoover's record.
For sure.
During the years of the civil rights movement in America, he seemed very hostile to the struggle for racial equality and was perpetually motivated to somehow prove that, at least from what I took away, that Americans striving for equal rights were in fact, kind of dupes of a communist plot. And essentially what I understood was that he came to despise Martin Luther King, who he suspected of being a communist. And the FBI targeted King for harassment. Agents went so far, I know we talked about offline, to send King a letter urging him to kill himself, essentially, or threatening that they'd share embarrassing information, presumably that was picked up by illegal FBI wiretaps that would be revealed to, his family, his friends, his followers. So there's something that I came across which I thought was interesting. Hoover's obituary in the New York Times, published a day after his death, mentioned that he publicly referred to King as the most notorious liar in the country. The obituary also noted that Hoover had invited reporters to hear tapes recorded in King's hotel room to prove that moral degenerates, as Hoover put it, were leading the civil rights movement.
It was definitely we said adversarial, but he would spend so many FBI resources on just trying to take down Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because if you look at MLK too, like he is very outspoken against communism. He says he goes, we Black Americans are Americans. We're not communists, and we don't have any room for that. And even MLK has conversations with the Kennedys. The Kennedys are telling him, look, you got to just stay away from some of these communists because it's going to be hard for us to defend you against,
Yep.
Hoover and the public. And he goes, yeah, okay, I understand that, and tries to make some arrangements. But I think the whole thing with the letter, I think we need to get into a little bit more because it is just absolutely mind blowing. So the FBI basically gets to a point where they're like, we got to take this guy down. After he does the "I have a dream" speech, everybody knows that this guy has galvanized the nation and is going to push racial equality in this movement into overdrive, especially now that the JFK is in power, and with Lyndon Johnson as well. Like, they're supporting him and trying to get his legislation put through. They claim that it's due to communism, but they try and they keep trying to find ways to say, oh, MLK's a communist and he's doing illegal activities, and he really doesn't. But like any person, nobody is squeaky clean when it comes to their life. And so through some of those wiretaps, like you were saying, they find him basically having sexual indiscretions, as it was called, with other women. And so they have that on tape, and they mail it to his house, and his wife actually opens the letter. And it was written anonymously, and it's Martin Luther King, and everybody who read it knew exactly who it was from, because like, who else has the capability to
do this,
create a tape like this? But I'll read just some parts of it. So it's sent anonymously, and it's supposed to be from I would say a fan, but like a follower who's found out about his indiscretions and is basically saying, you're the worst person around, and how can you live with yourself? So the letter starts out, it says, King, in view of your low-grade, abnormal personal behavior, I will not dignify your name with either a Mr. or a Reverend or a Doctor, and your last name calls to mind only the type of kings such as King Henry VIII and his countless acts of adultery, immoral conduct, lower than that of a beast. So that's how it starts out. And it just kind of goes into, you're a fraud. Everything you've done is fraudulent. Like, how can you disgrace yourself? He's won a Nobel Prize at this point. So it's saying like, what a farce that was. Calls him sexually psychotic, just kind of going on and on and on and on. And then at the end, it says, King, there is only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. You have just 34 days in which to do this. This exact number has been selected for a specific reason. It has definite practical significance. You are done. There is but one way out for you. You better take it before your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is bared to the nation. So it doesn't explicitly say you should kill yourself, but you can read between the lines saying you need to either step away and get away from the public's spotlight or just kill yourself. And the FBI wrote that. Like,
it's crazy.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
You've written a letter to, it's almost petty is the way I look at it, because like, you can't arrest this guy because you have nothing on him. So the only thing you have left is to say you did something that's not illegal, but definitely frowned upon. So you should probably kill yourself, or it's a blackmail essentially. Like
overreach. Like, yeah, it's just
it's illegal too, right? You've just started totally blackmailing something. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm sure that if someone looked into how you got that information vis-a-vis that wiretap, I'm sure that was illegal, right? Like, this is terrifying. Like, this is...
Yeah. So the FBI now, I think, is at its peak of, we don't care and we're going to do whatever we can because we have ultimate power, and Hoover thinks he can do no wrong. And even like, there was, I forget what president it was, but there was a point, I think it was, I don't know if it was Hoover was out doing something, and he told his aide, don't call me even if the president calls. And so like, the president would call and they'd be like, sorry, we can't reach him, just because Hoover didn't want to talk to the president. So like, that's the amount of power this guy had. So I'll go into a couple of things here just about kind of the FBI and the civil rights movement that I think are important as we kind of wrap up, just to see like to the level it got to, and then to the point where presidents had started to see what was going on. And I think I mentioned to you offline, like Harry Truman even said to Hoover, said, your FBI is starting to turn into a Gestapo/secret police, and that needs to stop immediately. And so if Truman ever said that, who knows where it would have gotten to, but it seems like it's starting to get closer and closer to that. So I think one of the things that's worth bringing up is the murder of Fred Hampton. So Fred Hampton was the leader of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panthers. And this is this insane story. So he is essentially drugged by an associate that was an informant. Basically, they'd caught somebody and said, hey, you're going to jail forever unless you drug Fred Hampton for us and give us a layout of his apartment or his house. And so there's a story of his pregnant wife is sitting there, and they see essentially some bullets come through the wall, and she starts like shaking him to say, get up, and he's just not moving. It's because he's been drugged. And all of a sudden the FBI and the Chicago police come into this house, and essentially it's an assassination mission. They start shooting various people in the building. And the eyewitness accounts say that Fred Hampton had been shot, but he wasn't dead. And they moved everybody out of his room. And then somebody said, is Hampton dead? And then they said, no, or one of the Black Panthers said, no, he's still alive. He needs help. And then all they heard was 2 gunshots from another room, and someone goes, now he's dead. So again, that is eyewitness accounts. So take everything with a grain of salt. But this is essentially the FBI assassinating an American citizen. So
it's a killing squad.
Yeah.
Right?
If you want to talk about overreach, that is exactly what Truman warned about, of Gestapo secret police level of overreach. Like, there's no warrants. There's nothing there. This is just an assassination mission. Yeah. And so this was all part of a counterintelligence program that basically was just keeping tabs on pretty much every Black person in America that had ever spoken out about anything. There was a crazy amount of files, and eventually some activists break into one of the FBI headquarters and steal a bunch of files and just kind of blows this wide open. They send things out to a bunch of national newspapers, and eventually it's the Washington Post who starts to send some of the stuff out. And then that's when we can kind of see the downfall of Hoover. And I think when Nixon comes in, starting to ask a few more questions kind of about how everything is going on, because essentially he ruled, like I said at the beginning, kind of mistakenly said that, but I think it was absolutely true. He ruled the FBI and didn't really have to report to anybody. It was his whatever he wanted to do at that point.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. I don't know, the sentiment just kind of crept into my mind, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I think this is very indicative of what happened with Hoover and the FBI.
Yeah. There's no other way to look at it, right? You can't be in power for that long and be unchecked, to the fact where presidents are scared of you. You don't report to Congress like the president does. You don't report to the voters like the president does. At the end of the day, the president is ultimate power, but Congress and the Senate can kick them out. Look at Nixon, right? You don't mess up, things can happen. If you're doing a bad job, the people can vote you out. What are you going to do with Hoover? He's got all this dirt on everybody. Even if they wanted him out, it would have been really hard to do so. And even with Nixon, right? I think there was a piece where Nixon realized he wanted to fire Hoover, and he was about to do it and kind of chickened out because he's like, I just can't, because he's just so powerful. Like, what could happen if...
That's absolutely terrifying.
Yeah.
Right? That's the most powerful man in the world, potentially.
Really?
Arguably. And he's afraid of the guy that runs his domestic law enforcement agency.
Mm-hmm. And it took death to take him out of the office.
Yeah, that's wild.
Yeah. And again, imagine he lived another 10, 15 years, right? What would have happened?
Oh, man.
Would somebody have had to step up and say, you're done? I'm sure more and more stuff would have leaked out, and there may have been enough public pressure to do so. But
I don't think he would leave. I don't think he would have left peacefully.
No, definitely not.
No.
The classic, would have had to drag him out kicking and screaming.
Yeah, 100%.
So yeah, I guess that kind of wraps up Hoover, right? And Hoover / the FBI. And then I think we kind of need to wrap up. I think maybe talk a bit about his legacy, because I'm flip-flopping back and forth based on some of the things you found. It's a tough one, I think. So where do you kind of fall on this?
Oh, man.
Easy questions we do here.
I always try to parse things out as best as I can based on the decision and what that person's legacy means as a whole. He modernized the FBI and took them into a new era. I think that was an undeniable objective fact, right? I think he turned the FBI into what they are today. However, I think his abuse of power, his overreach, his lack of care for civil rights, and the democratic process undermines a lot of what he accomplished. I don't think the FBI would be what it is today without him, but I think his overreach and his practices to essentially use the FBI as his own arm of law enforcement to execute his will, more or less, I have a hard time overlooking that. And I think that forever will, kind of cement the controversial legacy that he is remembered by. And I think many people would probably fall in a similar kind of camp with me.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. I think you cannot understate the work that he did to build the FBI up to what it is today. And like, even today, like, you think of, you don't mess really with the FBI and a lot of things, and they are very, very good at what they do today. I think
you
as
said
a result,
the building's named after him, right?
It is, yeah.
There you go.
And there's been some conversation as should that continue, but again, like, I almost would keep it in the sense of as a reminder, almost of
100%.
Teach that history properly. You can look at the great things you can do, but this is where power can, overreach. Like, look what happened with the NSA and Edward Snowden and everything. Like, it's exactly the same thing where a powerful organization that's maybe really efficient at what they do just steps over that line. And I come back to, whenever I look at leaders, and it's like, what are they trying to do in terms of what their level of duty is? Mm-hmm. He's supposed to protect America and American interests. and make sure that American citizens are free and can live to the ideals that the founders had brought through and all those sort of things. He really doesn't do that because he starts to break into that democratic process. He becomes that dictator, like kind of like a dictator, kind of like that supreme leader who doesn't have to, he's not accountable to anybody. And he builds that for himself through, whether it's blackmail and just all these other things. I think that's where things fall apart for me when I look at him. And I can definitely say, great job putting the FBI together. But at the same time, like, someone else could have done that. There's a lot of smart people out there. Would it have become what it is today? Maybe not. But would it have got to the point where, if you had a real true patriot in charge, like imagine George Washington was in charge, he would have been out in 10 years and been like, all right, I've done my work. I'm going to go retire. You got someone who's power hungry and doesn't have a family to go home to. He's just, his life is the FBI, and everything just kind of comes up to him. He's reporting into the president, but ultimately he's making a lot of the decisions himself. So anyways, this was a good one, I think, because I kind of came in with him of not knowing much about him. I knew kind of he was involved with the FBI, and I think I saw there's the MLK FBI documentary that I'd highly recommend that some people should watch. And it kind of goes into some of the stuff in a little bit more detail. But he's got an interesting life, and just how long he was in charge for, I think I didn't really realize. So interesting arc.
There's some important lessons learned here about checks and balances. And, just having those checks and balances can be very important, because even a patriot can lose sight of what that actually means at the end of the day.
Definitely. And it's, what are you looking for in terms of when it's like, hey, I'm a patriot, I'm doing the right thing for America. But if you start to define that yourself and no one around you can speak up, it gets really, really dangerous really quick. So, all right, I think that's a good place to wrap up. And just thank everybody again for tuning in, and we'll see you all in a couple of weeks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the History in Motion podcast. If you enjoyed our journey through time, please subscribe, rate us, and share the podcast with friends. Your support helps keep history alive. Until next time.